Hello. I want to talk to you about Great Gatsby and how Fitzgerald is making a claim or an argument about class structure. So, as you're listening to this, I want you to think, what arguments is Fitzgerald making about social class and class structure? When you guys read this story, many of us like to view Gatsby as a love story. And if people ask you, what's Gatsby about? Many of us will say, oh, it's a love story gone bad. It's a love story that didn't work out. The love story in here is a minor part of the plot. It's used as a way to Fitzgerald to help him make a claim about class structure and how it works. And so we need to look at Gatsby beyond a love story. It's great to talk about that, but let's talk about some other things as well. So, obviously, in chapter 2, George Wilson in the Valley of Ashes is the biggest, most obvious clue that, hey, I'm going to talk about class structure in my book. Actually, chapter 1, in the very first two paragraphs, Nick, our narrator, feels the need to tell us that he is from an upper social class and has various advantages over other people. So even then, we should have a big clue that this book is about social class. If we haven't yet, though, the Valley of Ashes definitely gives us that heads up. So let's just look at the imagery here describing George Wilson in the Valley of Ashes. The first is the interior was unprosperous and bare, right? Bare to describe the poor, very unlike Daisy's house, Gatsby's house, even Nick's house, even though Nick just lives in like a little bungalow. He mingles immediately with the cement color of the walls. He doesn't just blend in, you guys, he mingles. I think of mingling as mingling with talking to other people, right? Almost like the walls that kind of close in around him is really his only existence. He mingles with the walls. He even laughs in a colorless way. And then later, Tom picks up Wilson like a doll. Okay, the Valley of Ashes and George Wilson help show that the basic, like, not just that the poor were colorless, but people drove by them in between their homes to the office. Valley of Ashes is actually Queens in New York. Um, and the poor were disregarded, which is why they're described as the color gray. They just sort of like fit in, they go unnoticed. There's some great descriptions of these two women. Um, First of all, when Nick meets Jordan, she's laying on the couch. She gave no hint that she even saw him in the room. Now, think of that, you guys. Most of us would never not acknowledge another person who walked into the room. We would make some sort of eye contact, a nod at the very least. Most of us would jump up and greet that person. Jordan lays there. I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. Now, why should Nick have to apologize to Jordan? He was invited to this dinner by Daisy, but Jordan gives Nick the impression that she is deserving in an apology by just laying there. Um, it kind of helps to show the movement and the sort of behavior of the upper class. Sometimes Jordan and Miss Baker talked at once. I'm sorry, sometimes Daisy and Miss Baker talked at once unobtrusively and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They have impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. These women have never had to desire anything. Okay, Fitzgerald is indicating that they've always gotten exactly what they wanted, and that then affects their general behavior. There's a giant difference here between old and new money. And there is this selection of detail, this extra sort of scene in Gatsby where some of you might be reading and you're like, why is this even in here? Why do I need this 3 pages here? And it's the part in the book where a party of 3 on horseback shows up at Gatsby's house. And Gatsby says, I'm delighted to see you. I'm delighted that you dropped in. And then Nick writes as if they cared. Here we see Nick interject his thoughts. Remember, he is writing this scene a few years after it occurred and has had time to reflect. He's interrupting his own story to point out these people, the old money people, do not actually care anything about how Gatsby feels as a human being. How do we know that? Well, because on the very next page, Gatsby invites them to dinner and they don't want to stay. Okay. So the lady says, well, you come to dinner with me. Mr. Sloane gets to her feet. I assume that's her husband. I'm not sure. And says, come along, but to her only. Mr. Sloane doesn't include Gatsby and Nick in his eye contact there. All right. He says, get to your feet, and he only means her. Gatsby looked at me questioningly. He wanted to go, and he didn't see that Mr. Sloane had determined he shouldn't. Gatsby doesn't really get that he's not invited. Gatsby doesn't pick up on some of like the social cues of people around him. We won't be late if we start now, she insisted aloud. Gatsby says, I haven't got a horse. I used to ride in the army, but I've never bought a horse. I'll just have to follow you in my car. Excuse me for just a minute. Here, Gatsby is almost apologizing for not having a horse. No one should have to apologize for not having a horse, but Gatsby feels like he needs to in front of these people. Tom says, my God, I believe the man's coming. Doesn't she know? Doesn't he know she doesn't want him? Okay, he's not picking up that, hey, he's not wanted by these people. Gatsby could have as much money as them, he could have more than them. The point is, his money is new and his background is not the same as theirs. He has not been raised the same way, he has not had the same education, he does not have the same mannerisms. Imagery and selection of detail. Here's some great imagery when Gatsby's telling a story of he and Daisy meeting. There's an image of a ladder. Okay, this idea of moving up. Remember, all authors choose what to go in their books. There's this weird scene where Gatsby has this random guy living with them that just kind of stayed after one of his parties called Clip Springer. And he sits down and he plays a song for Gatsby, Daisy, and Nick. And he plays a song in which a line is, the rich get richer and the poor get children. This is a selection of detail that Fitzgerald chose. He could have chosen any song. He chose a song with this lyric. Why did he do that? What is he pointing out? Here we're going back to like Gatsby trying to fit in the pink suit, right? Like it was probably a really expensive suit, but it's kind of overly flashy. He's not quite fitting in with the old money. And then the word choices and voice that he uses, right? You can tell that he's choosing his words really wisely. It doesn't come naturally to him. Descriptions of movement and facial expressions. Jordan's kind of a minor character in this book, but the scenes that we have with her are really pivotal in understanding class structure and how the old money people, the people that were bred with money, sort of behave, at least according to Fitzgerald in this novel. Nick says, when we were at a house party together up in Warwick, Jordan left a borrowed car in the rain with the top down and then lied about it. Later, they have an argument that Jordan's a terrible driver. Either you oughtn't to be more careful or you oughtn't to drive at all, Nick tells her. I am careful. No, you're not. Well, other people are. she said lightly. They'll keep out of my way. It takes two to make an accident. Okay, the fact that Jordan thinks she doesn't have to be careful because the people around her will be careful tells us something about um, the way she views herself, that she doesn't have to be careful. All right, so there, I just wanted to interject a little bit on class structure with regard to Gatsby. This is way more than a love story. There's a lot going on here as far as what Fitzgerald is saying about the rich with their old money versus the rich with their new money and their behaviors, as well as the poor.